So government has allocated 1.7 billion rand to address potential disasters over the next 3 years. So Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said the funds would enable government to respond swiftly to climate-related emergencies. During the 2025 budget speech yesterday, Godongwana revealed that an additional 4 billion rand has been provisionally set aside to tackle the backlog in recovery efforts from past disasters. Well, to get reaction, we are joined now by Professor Christo Coetzee from the African Center for Disaster Studies at Northwest University. Prof, good afternoon to you. Thank you for giving us your time. I mean, this is quite the discussion, isn't it, where you've got 1.7 billion rand allocated by government to deal with potential disasters, but this is over a period of 3 years. As you look at those numbers and the amounts of disasters and inclement weather that we've seen, is it sufficient?
Well, Naledi, like they say with finances, the devil is always in the details. So I think it's a wonderful step by government to give more money towards disaster response and also disaster reduction. However, I'm going to also shock the viewers and say we currently don't have a money problem within disaster risk management. We have a spending problem. So just to give viewers an idea, if you look at the National Disaster Management Centre's annual report of 2022-2023, they put out the budget allocation for the 2022 floods, especially in KZN. And what you'll quickly observe there is they allocated for disaster response, in that instance, about 180 million rand to eThekwini alone to respond to that disaster, and only 50% of that budget was used. And if you actually, I would encourage the viewers at home actually to go and look at the annual reports of the National Disaster Management Centre and to see exactly how funds are getting used or not used in this instance in terms of disaster risk reduction and response. It hovers about, for all the money allocated by government or by Treasury, it hovers about 50 to 65% of the funds get used. The rest gets sent back to Treasury.
Yeah.
So we actually have a spending problem.
Well, Prof, we're looking at images right now from, hard-hit areas in previous storms in KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, communities that are desperate and destitute. And when you talk about half of 118 million rand possibly not being spent to these individuals, that could go a long way. Why is this money not reaching these individuals or these vulnerable communities?
Well, this could be multifaceted. Why this is? It could be to do with how those funds are allocated or the description of those funds are allocated. So it might be that it can only be used for disaster response. And once the disaster response period is over, you can't switch it over to risk reduction. For instance, that could be an issue with the Municipal Finance Management Act that limits or ring fences how funds are used. Another contributing factor is just in terms of just the human resource capacity within government is often lacking. So there's not enough people with the know-how, for instance, to actually know how to spend this money accurately and correctly. So those are, I think, two major contributing factors. There's probably more, but I think those are the two major ones I foresee.
Yeah. I imagine that in your work, you're also looking at the frequency of some of the and I want to say extreme weather, because whether you can attribute it to climate change or not is another thing. And perhaps you're more than welcome to answer that question. But I suppose the issue is, will we be seeing more of these types of weather events? Yeah,
so I think that's quite established science. So climate change is happening. However, I'm not in that camp that attributes every event that happens to climate change. For me, one of the bigger drivers that we observe, especially in our metropolitan areas, one of the bigger factors that contributes to disaster is rapid urbanization and uncontrolled urbanization, where people then settle in informal settlements, usually next to rivers or at other at-risk areas. So specifically, for instance, in Gauteng, on top of dolomitic land. So those factors play a major role, I think more so necessarily than climate change. And it's something that doesn't get the same attention as climate change, so that's problematic.
Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about, I suppose, addressing potential disasters that are coming over 3 years in this 1.7 billion rand that was allocated by the Finance Minister yesterday. But then what he also did is he set aside 4 billion rand to tackle the backlog in recovery efforts. So after the tragedy has happened, I mean, how swift have we been in going back to those communities and saying, well, let's get you back on your feet?
Yeah. So I think, again, that it comes back to the same problem. So government and Treasury can give as much money as they possibly can. And again, if viewers go interact with these annual reports, you'll be quite shocked at some of the numbers. I think the 2023-2024 annual report talks about a disaster recovery grant, and about 1.1 billion rand was allocated to that. And 0% of that was spent. So no municipality in South Africa actually spent that money. So again, the finance minister did a good job in actually allocating funds, but do we actually have the expertise to actually then go and spend that? I know taxpayers aren't always keen on government officials pay or spending their tax money, but in this instance, it's quite necessary. And I think we're already reaping the negative rewards of that not being the case.
Yeah, I wonder if the issue might be, particularly at municipal level, I suppose, the prioritizing of tasks where disaster management is concerned. So where there's the issue of, preparing for upcoming events, there is a prioritization, for instance, of infrastructure and drainage systems.
Yeah. So the major problem, if you go down to lower levels of government, is that municipal sub-departments don't necessarily always participate as they should by legislation in the disaster management activity. So the legislation says each municipal department, not just the disaster management center, should be involved in disaster management activities and should have disaster risk reduction projects. But now the problem in reality is all the work's actually left to, like I said, underfunded, understaffed disaster management centers that now have to do all these activities, and they just can't get to all these activities. So definitely a solution would be for there to be some onus and on municipal sub-departments to get more involved in disaster management activities. So then we'll already start to see funds being spent much more appropriately and risk being reduced.
Yeah, just a final question, I suppose, recommendations that you'd put on the table, what those would look like, whether it be at local government level or all the way up to national. And if there is, a sense of oversight to infrastructure that's necessary.
There's definitely a need to focus on our infrastructure. If you look at the eThekwini, there is a lot of, in terms of the flooding they experience, there's a lot down to the deterioration of the infrastructure over time. And there's a need for us to adapt our infrastructure to adapt to climate change. And there's a lot of modalities to actually do this. The science is there. It's just for public officials now to go and implement it and have that political will to actually do that.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us, Christo. We really do appreciate the time that you've given us this afternoon. Professor Christo Coetzee, the Professor of the African Center for Disaster Studies and Environmental Sciences at the Northwest University.